In the previous Soul Eater novel video, I covered Chapter 4, which covered the events of Rockland. In Chapter 4, Tir and his entourage arrived in Rockland to find the village overrun with bandits and the governor's mansion on fire. They fought off the Mount Seifu bandits and rescued Grady and Kanaan, who had been taken prisoner. The event played out completely differently than it does in the game. In this video, I'll be covering Chapter 5. Chapter 5 covers the events of Mount Seifu, which, much like the previous chapter, doesn't sound like a whole lot, but Mount Seifu also plays out very differently in the novel than it did in the game, so this video is going to be quite long. You know by now, I'll be doing full in-depth coverings of new and original scenes, as well as heavily altered game scenes, but quick summaries of scenes that are the same or similar to the game. And as always, I'll be doing no editing on these videos covering the novels, so treat them as an audio experience. If a picture appears in the book, I'll put it up on screen while talking about that scene, but aside from that, this video will be strictly audio with the cover of the novel. Chapter 5: The Righteous Bandits of Mount Seifu. Chapter 5 opens with Kanaan yelling at Tir and his entourage, asking them how long they plan on sleeping, and telling them that it's outrageous that he, their superior officer, is already awake while you scumbags are snoozing away. Kanaan's jeers pulled Tir and the others from sleep to reality. Rousing his still exhausted body, Tir managed to climb out of bed and say yes sir. Kanaan told them they've got 5 minutes to get ready and not to keep him waiting. Tir apologized and told him they'll be right there. Tir and the others collected their belongings and with no time to wash their faces, went downstairs. The 5 of them, still half asleep, met Grady in the dining room downstairs. Grady said good morning to everyone and Tir responded that their preparations are complete and they can depart any time. Grady rose from his chair and led them outside the inn. He told them that preparations are complete on his end as well. He found them a guide to take them to Mount Seifu, a child who climbs the mountain with her family to pick wild plants who happened to accidentally discover the bandits' hideout. Tir was surprised to see their guide was a little girl of 7 or 8 years old. He asked the girl what her name is, but the girl's mouth stayed tightly shut. Tir looked into her eyes and saw an angry or maybe resentful light shining there. He kneeled in front of her and smiled as he once again asked her what her name is, but the girl looked away angrily. Grady chimed in, seeming somewhat worried, and told Tir that her name is Haruna and telling him to treat her well. In the meantime, Gremio went to the stable and came out leading the horses. While straddling his horse, Kanaan told everyone it's time to head out. They left town trailing after Kanaan and galloped towards Mount Seifu in the east. Kanaan led, next came Tir and Haruna. Gremio and Ted's horses were side by side and Cleo and Pon guarded the rear. They finally reached the foot of the mountain after half a day's travel. The mountain had been named for the cold wind that whistles down from its peaks, but in this season it was relatively warm. However, the weather had also caused the plants to grow and block the road. They tied the horses to the trees at the foot of the mountain since they couldn't possibly fit through the path and prepared to climb the mountain on foot. Kanaan told Haruna to lead them to the bandits' hideout while forcing his own luggage onto Pon. Pon gritted his teeth but managed to stay silent. Gremio asked if they should go as he led the way. Haruna followed after him with Tir closely behind. Haruna pointed the way as Gremio cleared a path through the branches with his axe. After walking for some time, Kanaan asked Haruna if they're there yet, but Haruna shook her head. After walking some more, he once again asked her if they're there yet, and again and again. This went on for some time. Finally, Haruna spoke for the first time and told everyone that they're almost there. Kanaan told them to hurry it up, scumbags, as he hurried Gremio to clear the path quicker. After Gremio had cleared who knows how many large branches, he said, "What's that?" Everyone responded to the surprise in Gremio's voice and automatically looked ahead. The forest thinned out past the cleared away branches. In the middle of the forest meadow beyond, they could see the hideout made of wood. The fence around the perimeter was as high as 2 adults. From the state of the wood, the fortress looked like it had been constructed 2 or 3 years prior. The fence blocked their view into the hideout, but from the little exterior of the building and the thatched straw roof they could see, it looked like it had 2 stories and was about the size of an inn. It could probably house 40 to 50 bandits. As the towering front gate was tightly shut, it seemed they would have to think of some other means of launching their assault. But before they knew what hit them, Kanaan drew his sword and roared in a rousing voice, calling everyone scum and telling them to follow him in charge. With a speed that surprised Tir, Kanaan dashed into the field and towards the face of the hideout. Tir and the others had no choice but to run after him. Suddenly, Kanaan was sucked into the earth, and in the same instant a huge hole opened up in the ground under the rest of their feet. The five were helplessly swallowed into the hole, along with the earth and sand. Tir asked everybody if they were okay as he surveyed their surroundings in the dim light, wiping the mud from his body. Ted grunted what the hell was that as his voice strained from the pain. Always worried about Tir, Gremio asked the young master if he was hurt. Pan groaned in embarrassment at being caught in a trap. Cleo calmly analysed the situation and wondered if this pitfall was the bandits' handiwork. Kanaan groaned in pain and ordered everyone to hurry up and get them out of here. At Kanaan's words, they all looked upwards. The hole was fairly deep and there didn't seem to be anything at all they could use to climb out. Everyone sighed deeply, but Tir cried out Haruna's name and asked where she is. Gremio told Tir to wait a moment while rummaging through his bag. He pulled something out and a light sparked. Gremio had created an impromptu torch by lighting a piece of wood on fire. Tir looked around the hole they'd fallen into in the flickering light cast by the flame. The bottom of the hole was about the size of a small yard. He could see the 6 of them smeared with mud and the twigs that had tumbled down with them, but Gremio held up the torch and looked around, and with a worried look he said Haruna's not here. Ted commented maybe she didn't fall in. Kanaan then suggested that she can throw them a grass or vine rope as he commented what a genius he is. Kanaan called out to Haruna, but there was no answer. Pan suggested that perhaps she got scared and ran away when they all fell into the hole, as the bandits' hideout was right there in front of them. Pan's words reminded Tir of something. Tir had been ordered to follow Kanaan, but that didn't mean that Haruna did too. Tir gave a small sigh of relief, but Kanaan's expression was sour. Kanaan humphed and blurted out, "Just when the treasure is finally right in front of us." Kanaan clapped his hand over his mouth in alarm and quickly told the group to forget that. He then called them scum and told them they need to figure out how to get them out of here. Gremio commented if they can't go up, they must go forward. He then told the others to look as he held the torch high, illuminating a cave in the wall behind Kanaan. Kanaan let out a laugh and said he already knew that was there. With no other option, Tir and the rest stepped into the cave as Kanaan's convulsive laughter echoed off its walls. Gremio went first holding the torch. Next came Tir and Ted. After that came Cleo, and Kanaan and Pan brought up the rear because his large frame would block the light of the torch. The tunnel was filled with the smell of wet earth. They'd walked through it for some time, but Gremio suddenly stopped. Gremio commented the tunnel branches off and asked the others what they should do as he showed them the fork in the tunnel. Kanaan confidently shrieked they should go right. Ted suggested they leave some kind of marker before checking out one of the branches in the path. Glancing at the two of them, Cleo moved to stand next to Gremio. She peered into each tunnel in turn. In times like these, they relied on Cleo's powers of calm judgment and insight. Cleo grunted but then grimaced and said no more. Tir asked her what's wrong. Cleo replied that she noticed a while ago, but it seems they're in trouble. With his voice trembling, Kanaan asked her what she means. Cleo responded that the smell in the cave is getting stronger and it seems that something lives here. Tir shouted out, "What?" The second Tir shouted, Cleo held her finger to her lips for silence. Everyone listened carefully at the mouth of the tunnels. It was faint, but they could hear what sounded like something rustling around in either the left or right tunnel. In a panic, Gremio shouted out, "What is that?" as he held the torch high. In that little circle of light, Tir saw into the 2 tunnels. 2 antennae wiggled eerily at the end of a black shining body. A huge swarm of ants as big as dogs advanced towards them. Tir gripped his staff and grumbled, now they have to deal with this too. The other 4 prepared their respective weapons, but Kanaan turned tail and fled back along the path they had just come down. At Kanaan's act of cowardice, Ted spat and said, "Commanding officer, my ass." Pan gripped his claws tightly and asked what do they do now. He commented that there's tons of them and they can't take them all down. Cleo held her throwing knives tightly and said they don't have much of a choice as all that's behind them is a dead end. Gremio commented here they come and handed Tir the torch as he took up his axe. He told the group that since the tunnel is so narrow they won't all be able to attack at once, so he and Cleo will go first and they'll switch out when they get tired. Gremio was cut off mid-sentence. One of the ants leapt out and tackled him from behind. Cleo called him an idiot and told him to watch out as she sliced the ant's head off with her knife. Blood spewed out of the ant and splattered Cleo's breastplate. A disgusting smell like rotten sap immediately filled the tunnel. The ants' bodies began to change colour right before their eyes. Their black bodies became tinged with red, and their eyes began to shine red too. The cave was filled with a noise like something hard grinding together. The ants were probably making the noise to intimidate them. Pan shouted out in disbelief that the smell of their allies' blood has sent them into battle mode. Another ant leapt at Gremio. This one was much faster than before. It grabbed Gremio with its appendages and sunk its huge mandibles into his leg. Tir cried out, "You bastard," at the ant and used his staff to send the ant flying back. Blood ran out of Gremio's leg where the ant had bitten him. Pan told Gremio to fall back as he pulled Gremio back behind him by the cape and charged out yelling. Cleo and Pan took turns fighting off the attacking ants in front, but the ants, gushing out one after another, forced Tir and company back step by step. Ted shouted out, "This is bad, they're gonna get us," as he propped Gremio up. Tir looked over his shoulder and could see the faint light of the sun coming in through the mouth of the tunnel. They'd been pushed back to where they first fell in. To Tir's left, a section of the dirt wall crumbled and gave way. He didn't even have time to shift his grip on his staff as an ant's mandibles burst from the hole. Tir instinctively jumped out of the way, but immediately bumped into something. There was no space left to retreat to. Cleo and Pan had squeezed into the area as well. Tir turned to Ted and tossed him the torch. A wave of ants came gushing out of the tunnel. He couldn't cut the ants' bodies with his staff, but luckily, attacking where they were segmented seemed to stun them. He caught sight of Cleo and Pan while he shouted and fought back the ants. They were covered in blood and fighting hard against the seemingly endless tide of ants that continued to appear. Pan and Cleo inched backwards, using themselves as shields and slowly retreating. Kanaan cried out for them to get away from him and not to come near him. They fell into formation and added the screaming Kanaan to their ranks, making a total of 6. Tir asked how they're going to get out of this mess as he kept his eyes on the ants. The ants suddenly stopped attacking. Their feelers continued to wave about, but they showed no signs of attacking Tir's group. Tir turned to Cleo and asked them what they're doing, but she held her fingers to her lips for quiet. The group listened carefully. Tir heard an ominous noise in the spaces between their heavy breathing and the ants' grinding mandibles. It was a sound like something heavy was being dragged through the narrow tunnel, and it was getting closer. Their feelers waving, heads searching, the ants mysteriously marched in ones and twos back down the tunnel they had come through, and after the last ant had disappeared into the mouth of the tunnel, 2 red lights rose up in the pitch-black darkness of the tunnel. An ant's eyes, but these eyes were as big as a human's fist, much larger than the ants they'd been fighting up until now. They held their breath as the glowing lights slowly drew closer. The eerie noise grew louder. Earth and sand showered down on everyone as they watched. A huge ant came bursting through the tunnel opening and advanced towards them. Looking up at the giant ant towering over them, Cleo commented she must be the queen ant, and if they can bring her down, the others will scatter in disarray. Pan gave out a laugh as he jokingly commented, "So ants and bandits have something in common." His voice quavering, Kanaan asked how they're going to bring her down. Ted butted in and joked, maybe she's here to escort them to the ants' food locker. Kanaan clung to the cave wall on the verge of tears and begged them to protect him. Tir turned to Cleo and asked her what's the best way to do this. Cleo responded that the queen ant's body doesn't seem to be that different from the soldier ants they'd been fighting up until now. In that instant, they heard the sound of wind rushing by and the queen ant stomped on Tir. Tir immediately raised his staff, but it didn't hold and was sent flying backwards. The force flung his body back against the cave wall. Dragging his injured leg, Gremio shouted out, "How dare you attack the young master?" His whole body filled with rage, Gremio swung his axe, but he was no match for the queen ant in his injured state. The ant's retaliating attack struck Gremio's flank and injured leg, and Gremio blacked out from the pain. Ted called out Gremio's name and rushed to his side. Cleo and Pan immediately attacked to draw the queen ant's attention away from Gremio, but they couldn't even dent her hard carapace. With a heavy thud, the queen ant's leg made contact with Pan and he clung to the cave wall. Tir stood up to challenge her, but the best he could do was to ward off her attacks. Ted provided backup with his bow, but his arrows didn't even scratch the queen ant. Cleo was finally struck down with a grunt. Tir attacked the queen ant once again, but was sent tumbling back. The queen reared up. She chirped in victory, surveying the 6 of them grovelling on their hands and knees. Tir cried out, "Damn, isn't there anything we can do?" as he stood up and looked at the Queen Ant despite his injuries. Just then, something fell beside Tir with a dry, dusty sound. Tir looked at the ground where he saw Ted's leather gloves. The gloves that Ted had never once taken off in front of Tir before. The ones that hid his burns. Ted was standing right next to Tir. He faced the Queen Ant with a look in his eyes like he had come to a decision. Ted told everyone to step back. Tir asked him what he plans on doing, and Ted replied, "You'll see," as he held up his right hand and closed his eyes. Tir snuck a look at Ted's hand, even while thinking he shouldn't, and noticed there were no burns on Ted's hand. A strange design was carved into the back of Ted's hand. He didn't know why, but the design, a flickering shadow wielding a huge scythe, filled Tir with fear. The carving seemed to suck Tir in as he stared at it, and he felt as though that huge scythe would steal away all that he held dear. Cleo pushed Tir close to the wall and covered him as she murmured, "A rune?" Tir was shocked to find Ted had a rune on his right hand, but he was also worried about Ted too, because the frightening outward appearance of Ted's rune suggested it might hold a great power, and it would take more than some half-baked magic to bring down the Queen Ant. Tir told Ted not to, that it's too dangerous. Ted laughed and thanked Tir for worrying about him as he turned to face the Queen Ant once more. Ted and the Queen Ant glared at each other. Soon the Queen Ant shook her head and began chirping threateningly. But Ted, still holding his hand aloft, was not shaken. While everyone watched with bated breath, the Queen finally took a step towards Ted. Right in front of them, the Queen took aim at Ted and lifted her foot. In that moment, "O rune embedded in my body, show your power," Ted's shout echoed in the cave. With a sound that rent the very air, the Queen swung her leg at Ted with tremendous speed. Tir shouted out, "Ted!" The instant Tir shouted, a pitch-black shape darker than midnight gushed out of Ted's right hand. The darkness drew close to Ted, and just when it seemed it might swallow him, it suddenly coiled about the Queen Ant. It wrapped around her giant body, and gathering speed, was sucked down into the earth. The Queen Ant and the darkness both vanished. Ted sighed and hung his head as if exhausted. Putting on his gloves, he whispered to Tir that he's sorry for startling him. Tir, having just seen something he couldn't understand, asked Ted what in the world was that. Ted looked at Tir with kind eyes and gently told him he can't explain right now, but he promises he'll tell him when they get home safe and sound. Tir gave a small nod and Ted went back to being his usual self. Ted then cheerfully said they should hurry up and beat the bandits so they can go home to Gregminster. After treating Gremio's injuries, they lit the torch and once again headed into the tunnel. They travelled along the tunnel that had grown considerably wider thanks to the Queen Ant's passage, and when they finally reached the fork in the road from before, Cleo compared the tunnels by eyeballing and sniffing them. She said the right tunnel leads down to the Queen Ant's nest, and the tunnel on the left leads above ground. The group advanced through the left tunnel, the direction opposite from Kanaan's earlier suggestion. Tir took a look at Kanaan, but all his pompous authority from before had completely disappeared, and he had become totally docile. As the tunnel began to slope upward, Tir noticed the strange change in Kanaan. Though he continued trudging along in silence, he shot a glance in Ted's direction every so often. He must have been thinking about the magic Ted had used earlier. Cleo commented she sees the exit. Tir lifted his head and he could see a dim light ahead. He gave out a cheerful shout that they're saved and caught Ted's eye as they raced out. They stopped and stood frozen at the exit, and Pon curiously asked them what's wrong. They both turned to him and put their fingers on their lips. After the three others in Kanaan had caught up, they looked outside without making a sound. "I see, so that's how it is," Gremio murmured in his usual voice, whether or not the pain in his leg had abated. They could see the bandits' hideout perched on its hill, just a little ways away from the exit of the ants' nest. It seemed the cave led to the back door of the fortress. Cleo spoke while rummaging around in her bag. She told Tir that they're exhausted from their fight against the ants and she's worried about Gremio's leg. Tir asked her what they should do. From her bag, Cleo pulled out several sheets of cloth and a small leather bag filled with oil, as well as a number of knives. She said there's nothing better than a surprise attack, and luckily there's no watch posted at the back of the fortress, so if they set a fire they'll throw the bandits into a state of confusion, and then they'll attack. Hans suggested splitting into two groups. One group to fan the flames to throw the bandits into chaos, and a second group to ambush the fleeing bandits at the gate. Kanaan interrupted and said that's a good idea and he'll fight this time too, as he was just warming up earlier. Cleo gazed at Kanaan in amazement and asked him which group he wants to go with. Kanaan responded he wants to go inside the fortress and he'll knock the bandits senseless. Cleo huffed with a laugh but didn't say any more. At the end of their short discussions, everyone's roles were decided. Tir, Cleo and Kanaan would go inside the fortress, while Gremio, Ted and Pan would wait at the front gate to ambush the bandits. Cleo wrapped her knives and Ted's arrows in cloth and soaked them in oil. She then used a flint to ignite them. Putting the flint away in his bag, Gremio told Tir to be careful and said he'd go around the front. Tir responded that he will and told Gremio not to push himself too hard either. As they spoke, the flame took to the knives and arrows and began to burn brightly. Cleo ordered Ted to go and Ted responded, "Yes, ma'am." Ted and Cleo sent flames hurtling towards the fortress. Ted's arrows and Cleo's knives lodged into the fence surrounding it and smoke and flames began to rise. Using the thicket as cover, everyone snuck towards the fortress. They divided into their groups and waited for the fire to spread. Men's voices rose in panic and sounds of confusion came from within. Tir gripped his staff and listened as the turmoil grew louder. The two leaders he had met the day before in Rockland, the Tin Man and the man who called himself Varkas of the Whirlwind Axe, both ought to be inside this fortress as well. Just thinking about them made his fighting spirit soar even higher. The fire then spread, burning down the gate. "Alright, here we go," said Tir and Cleo. Tir and Cleo began running at the same time. Kanaan lagged a little behind them, carrying a flashy decorative sword that looked like it was never expected to see use in actual combat. The three of them ran up the slope, finally arriving at the gate. Cleo kicked down the remains of the back gate and nimbly slipped inside. A bandit shouted out "bastards" and attacked Cleo with an axe. Tir silenced him with a thrust of his staff over Cleo's shoulder. Tir and Cleo then switched places. Tir took down the bandits nearby, and Cleo covered the ones further away. Unnoticed, Kanaan disappeared. The two of them drew closer to the fortress, whose outer walls were already scorched, and smoke began to pour out of the windows. Cleo told Tir to head inside. Tir responded got it, but then 10 bandits appeared roaring angrily. There were even more bandits at the fortress than expected, and the brawl increased the distance between Tir and Cleo. Cleo shouted at the young master to head inside, and she'll take care of these bandits as her knives hit the bandits' vital points. Tir kicked in the back door and rushed inside the fort. Big iron pots and pans flew out of the kitchen into the hallway as several bandits tried to gather together daily necessities in a panic. Tir struck down the surprise bandits one after another. He spotted a staircase leading up to the second floor, but just as he was about to run up the stairs, he stopped in shock. Varkas was standing at the top of the stairs, carrying Haruna in his arms. Staring at Tir in surprise, Varkas' voice rumbled down the stairs, saying, "Didn't you fall into the ant's nest?" Tir told him to let Haruna go. Varkas laughed and said, "First you set my fort on fire, and now you're pretending to be a prince here to rescue the princess." No sooner were the words out of his mouth than Varkas launched himself out the window, still carrying Haruna in his arms. In that instant, Tir saw Haruna clinging tightly to Varkas and scowling furiously at him over Varkas' shoulder. Uncomprehending, Tir ran up the stairs and leapt out the window after them. He hit the ground running in pursuit. As he did, the thin accomplice hurried up to Varkas leading a horse. Varkas called out to Sidonia to give him the horse. Varkas placed Haruna on the horse and mounted it behind her. Then they and Sidonia rode out the back gate. Tir jumped on a nearby horse and rode through the gate after them. Varkas called him a persistent brat. They rode down the mountain path and out of the woods into a meadow, with Tir chasing after them. Varkas groaned what a pain in the ass and reined in his horse. He shouted at Tir that he stumbled into his own graveyard. Tir's entire body was alive with tension. He'd been so focused on saving Haruna that he hadn't stopped to think about the 2-on-1 odds of the fight. Still riding with Haruna, Varkas charged at Tir. In the blink of an eye, Varkas had galloped alongside Tir and was swinging his axe. Undaunted, Tir responded to his attack, but Varkas' skill with the axe was stunning. One moment they exchanged blows, and in the next, Varkas was already launching his next attack. His axe really was a whirlwind, roaring as it swooped down. Tir was on edge as they traded blows. Sidonia was at Varkus's back watching the fight closely, ready to step in and provide assistance if need be. On top of that, Haruna was on Varkus's horse. One slip up and he might injure her, so Tir deliberately lowered his staff, leaving himself open. Tir waited and Varkus raised his axe high. Varkus swung his axe down, just what Tir had been waiting for. He raised his staff with both hands and stopped a blow at the axe's shaft. The blade of the axe shone coldly right at the tip of Tir's nose. With a shout, Tir bent his body with all his strength. He had read Varkus's movements. Varkus cried out, "What the?" Tir knocked Varkus's axe out of his hands and sent it flying. He then used the recoil of his bent body and swung his staff with all his might. Haruna cried out to Tir to stop, and his staff halted just short of striking Varkus's face. Haruna asked Tir why he's doing such terrible things to her uncle Varkus. Haruna then began crying and begged Tir to stop as she buried her face in the horse's mane. Tir lowered his staff and asked Haruna why she's... Haruna replied that Uncle Varkus isn't a bad person. She told Tir that the Imperials are the bad guys and Varkus saved the townsfolk. With that, Haruna raised her head. Rage smouldered in her eyes, the same as it had when they first met this morning. Varkus, sounding as if he had prepared himself for the worst, commented to Tir, "Is that all?" Tir hung his head and said he has no reason to attack him. Haruna's words, her eyes, they brought back all the suspicions he'd been harbouring deep in his heart. The people laughing and pointing at Grady's burning mansion. The taxes that were still in the storehouse. His head still hanging, Tir asked Varkus to please tell him what's happening in Rockland. Varkus barked with laughter in surprise and commented this is interesting. He then asked Tir isn't he a member of the Imperial Guard. Tir asked what of it. Varkus replied he thought all Imperials were like Grady and Kanaan, but it seems some of you have got spine. He told Tir that Governor Grady has been taxing the townspeople something terrible. The taxes they'd paid before Grady came along were nothing in comparison to what they're paying now. Tir didn't reply. He felt like Varkus's words were slowly squeezing his own heart. Varkus continued. He said that bastard Grady uses his title of governor as an excuse to suck the townspeople dry, and remarked that's the usual way of doing things. Throw those who don't pay taxes into prison and keep them there for however long you like. Tir replied, but that's... Varkus interrupted and continued his explanation. He told Tir that's not even the half of it. When Kanaan showed up, things got even worse. He imposed a tax for growing facial hair, a tax for wearing clothes, and a tax for married couples to sleep in the same bed. Tir shouted out he's lying, that there's no way the Empire would ever allow that. It was the sad cry of a heart that had lost its way, a scream straight from Tir's heart, the heart that had gone on believing in the Empire that Barbarossa had governed, the Empire that his father protected. Varkus questioned Tir, asking him if he really thinks so. Varkus then shifted his horse, bringing Haruna into view. She wasn't crying any longer, but the emotion brimming in her eyes hadn't changed. Haruna told Tir that it's true, that the Empire treats them like scum. Tell me one thing, Tir said to Haruna. He asked her if she deliberately led them on the path to the fortress. Haruna replied she did, that she led them straight to the ants' nest so they'd be caught by Uncle Varkus. Tir didn't blame Haruna, it was the Empire that had forced her to make such a cruel decision. Varkus asked Tir if he gets it now, that they take money from Grady and return it to the townspeople, that Haruna's family don't come here to pick herbs and the other townsfolk don't come to hunt boar or gather firewood, they come to get back their money he stole from Grady. As Varkus finished speaking, Tir pointed to the woods with his staff and told him to go. Varkus responded, and Tir told him to go, that he doesn't want to see his face in Rockland again. Varkus grinned and moved his horse back. He told Tir that they've got more than one base and they'll hide out there until things die down. Varkus then stared at Tir and told him that Rockland isn't the only place being abused by the Empire like this, and he'll fight to the bitter end if the Empire continues to torment its people. Tir was left silent at Varkus's words. Varkus turned around and led his horse to Sidonia's side and asked, what about Haruna's family? Sidonia replied there's no cause for concern as he got her family out of town long ago. Varkus told him good job, and since that's taken care of, there's no need for this place anymore. Listening to their conversation, Tir turned his horse around, his shattered heart weighing heavy in his chest. The fortress at the top of the mountain was already wrapped in flames, black smoke rising into the sunset-stained sky. "Oh right," said Varkas. Tir turned back around at Varkas's voice. Varkas asked him what his name is, and Tir responded, "Tir McDohl." Varkas laughed and said he'll remember that, and maybe one day they'll meet again. With that said, Varkas, Sidonia and Haruna disappeared into the depths of the forest. And that's the end of Chapter 5. So just like with Chapter 4, you can see why I went into so much depth covering this chapter. Chapter 4 and 5 covered the Mount Seifu bandits, and it played out completely differently than it did in the game. I think it's a massive improvement over how this portion was handled in the game. It gave the characters so much more to do and say. We got to see things from the villagers' perspectives thanks to Haruna, and we got to see just how corrupt Grady and Kanaan are. It also gave us a much better look at the Mount Seifu bandits and how they're viewed almost as saviors of the people. The novel did a much better job presenting them as Robin Hood style figures, which the game failed to do. Anyway, in the next video I'll cover Chapter 6, which wraps up the Rockland tax arc and covers Tir's return to Gregminster and Ted's meeting with Windy. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll catch you on the next one.